And depending where you are in the world right now, coronavirus could still be a major threat, a retreating one, or you might even be hoping that you've almost seen the back of it. Large areas of the world still, of course, desperately need vaccines. That problem raising the threat of new variants for those areas with stronger vaccination programs. In other places, the situation is easing, but is it really safe to relax? Well, let's take stock and examine the latest evidence. My guest today is Professor of Epidemiology at the University of New South Wales in Australia, particular expertise in hospital infections and infectious diseases control, Professor Mary-Louise McLaws. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme today. For many of us, particularly here in the Northern Hemisphere, it's the start of a new school year, hopefully a new chapter. Here in France and in much of Europe, the situation seems to be easing. Do you think we can relax?
Not until you get enough of everybody in the globe being vaccinated, because don't forget, the more people who aren't vaccinated, the more likely it will be that we will get variants of concern or variants of interest. So really, it's everyone's best interest that we have the globe vaccinated. And quite frankly, we're way from that goal just yet. I mean, the world vaccination rate, I was just looking it up, and it's about 39% of the total global population have been vaccinated. And that's not nearly yet high enough.
Yeah, you say nearly 40%. I remember seeing figures earlier on in the year from French experts saying here in France, you need to get to well over 80, perhaps even 90% of people vaccinated. I mean, do you think that's the case around the world?
That's correct. I mean, look, herd immunity is very difficult to acquire, particularly given Delta now. It has reduced vaccine efficacy against transmission of symptomatic disease. However, all the vaccines are fantastic because they stop you from hospitalization and death. That's great. But we will continue to see a virus circulating. And for many, that will mean that they won't respond very well and they will need hospitalization. So every country, including France, will have to start looking at increasing bed capacity, increasing staff capacity for ICU and infectious diseases care, increasing the idea of boosters, but not until nearly everybody has at least had one shot. So we're a long way from that. And in Australia, we're a high income country and we haven't had enough people vaccinated yet. And it's not because of vaccine hesitancy. It's because we don't have enough vaccine in Australia. And we're very, very fortunate that our wonderful neighbour Singapore is giving us 500,000 doses. That's not a lot, but that's better than nothing. And we'll then give back 500,000 doses later on in the year. But really, the total population, only 27% has been fully vaccinated in Australia. So we've got circulating Delta. And the question is, will we be able to open up when we get to 70%? Now, that's 70% of the adult population that the government's thinking about, and yet 100% of the population's at risk of Delta. No country yet has started to vaccinate under 12 years of age, but we've just passed a law that says we can vaccinate the 12-year-olds up to 16, and that's great news, but we don't have enough vaccine.
Do you think the government there in Australia got it wrong? Because I mean, originally there wasn't there the idea of closing the borders to stop coronavirus even being able to start spreading? I mean, was that a big failure by the government?
Well, we closed the borders and that was great. We kept the virus out, but then of course our quarantine program let us down. We've had at least 42,000 cases that have been directly or indirectly related to breaches from the quarantine program, because you can't, once you arrive in Australia, you can't actually go into the community unless you go into quarantine. And so all of those cases have been due to a problem with quarantine, including this current one, Delta. So we did a great job, but what we didn't do when we got to zero was use that honeymoon period to vaccinate everybody, because we didn't have enough vaccine supply. We didn't have enough Pfizer. We, of course, weren't producing enough AstraZeneca. Then there was a little bit of an anxiety around the side effect of AstraZeneca. Then everyone got over that anxiety to realize it's not really a big problem at all. But it's just really being able to get an appointment, and you can't get an appointment if you're under 40 for love or money at the moment. It is very, very difficult. And yet the under 40s represent 69% of all caseload in Australia.
You mentioned the word, sorry to interrupt, but I just want to move on quickly. You mentioned the word variants a minute ago. I mean, to start with, we had initial coronavirus, if you like. Then we had Alpha, then we had Delta. The fear is, of course, that this could just keep producing another variant and things will just go back, get much worse once again, particularly in places like here in Europe where we appear to be almost over the hump.
Look, I think that once we get the majority of people vaccinated, then sure, we will. It's a bit like the flu vaccine. It works for one season, but maybe not the next. So yes, we will all eventually get some sort of symptomatic disease, but let's hope that because we have received a vaccine, even if it's slightly out of date, that we won't have a deadly dose of the virus. And let's hope also that the messenger RNA producers can start tweaking their vaccine according to the new variant of concern or variant of interest. So I'm at least a little positive about the future, but only when the majority of us have had at least one dose.
And is it possible, I know this is a very difficult question, but is it possible to put any kind of time scale on that? I mean, I've heard, again, experts here in France saying potentially 2022, we may get to the point where enough people have been vaccinated where really the world has got over the hump.
Oh, yes. Well, look, if you have a look at the sensational rollout of the vaccine in Israel, they started rolling out in December. Right now, after 8 months, they've got about 70% of their population have had double dose, but they're now starting to see some neutralizing antibodies start waning and they need booster shots. So if it took them 8 months, then it will take at least to the rest of the world at least twice that. We are not going to be able to get into low and middle income countries to boost fast enough if Israel took that long to be able to get 70%. So sadly, we're going to be seeing circulating virus or variants of concern for at least another year until we can get the majority of the world vaccinated. Look, it took a long time for WHO to get the polio eradicated. And of course, we haven't seen many diseases eradicated. It's very hard work. But given that this is a pandemic and everybody's thinking about getting rid of this and getting back to normal life, we should be able to vaccine faster than, for example, polio. But nevertheless, it's not going to happen in a year, at least a couple of years.
Good to hear the reality. Good to hear a little bit of optimism as well. Thanks very much to you for joining us today, Professor Mary-Louise
McLaws,
joining us from the University of New South Wales in Australia. Thanks very much.